What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today,
it's Monday. You know what time it is. Time to get into those hot waiver ads as we head into week 5. I will say overall that this is a more balanced week, meaning we have equal amount of running backs, wide receivers, and even some quarterbacks and tight ends with some new names that we haven't had in previous weeks. But we also have some players who've been on the waiver wire for quite a bit, quietly producing, but after several weeks, it's time that we give them some consideration. Before we do get into the video though, as per usual, we'll begin with the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which running back has seen the lowest percentage of 8+ defenders in the box. The correct answer was actually David Montgomery. Congratulations to @BruceRubens, the first to get this right on Twitter. Nobody on YouTube had yet got this question correct. But as for today's stat of the day, through 4 weeks, Deebo Samuel leads the league in average yards after catch per reception. Which player ranks second just behind him? There has to be a minimum of 20 targets received by this player, but once again, that's Deebo Samuel leading the league in yards after catch per reception. Which player ranks second just behind him? Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Alright guys, now without further ado, let's hop right into the video, and as per usual, we'll begin with running back, which has the player on the thumbnail. Shouldn't come as no surprise, but it's Damien Williams of the Chicago Bears. Unfortunate news for David Montgomery owners, but he did sustain a knee injury in this week's contest and did have to get helped off the field, which does indicate it's potentially a more serious injury. In his place, we saw Damien Williams play a workhorse type of role when it comes to snaps, heavily involved in both the run game and the receiving game. So with him slated to take the position of David Montgomery being that workhorse running back in this offense, we should expect a similar type of production to come out of him, except he's a player we can actually find off the waiver wire this week, so it could be a real game changer for some teams out there that may be thin at the position. And as mentioned, since he did have to be helped off the field, this is likely going to be an injury that holds him out for multiple weeks. His next 2 games and matchups are against the Las Vegas Raiders and the Green Bay Packers, 2 teams very beatable at the running back position, so Damien Williams being the next man up, he'll likely be ranked close to the top 12, if not in the top 12 in those 2 matchups. I do feel strongly that this week, out of all weeks so far on the waiver wire, has been the thinnest for the running back position, but coming in second, we have Kenneth Gainwell, a player that a lot of you have added over the past several weeks. He's had decent involvement even while Miles Sanders is healthy, but coming to a pinnacle this past weekend, a game in which he saw 9 total touches, posting 89 total yards, even scoring a touchdown in the process, posting his best fantasy day of his young career. But to me, the part that was most telling, and the reason that I do have him ranked so highly on this waiver list, is that he only had 1 fewer touch than Miles Sanders in this contest, even scoring more fantasy points than him as well. So it's even possible without an injury to Miles Sanders, Kenneth Gainwell can have enough production to sustain fantasy value and fantasy startability. So for that reason, I do have him as a top add at the running back position, but as mentioned, it is a thinner week for running backs. In fact, I only have one other rusher listed in the waiver wire video today, and that's going to be Samaje Perine of the Cincinnati Bengals. Joe Mixon and the Cincinnati Bengals played the Jacksonville Jaguars on Thursday night, and towards the tail end of that game, you may have noticed, I know Joe Mixon owners noticed, but he was taken out of that game. In his absence, Samaje Perine did step up and was playing a lion's share of the touches out of the backfield, being involved in both the receiving game and run game. So a similar situation to what we had mentioned with Damien Williams. It's likely Samaje Perine, if Joe Mixon does miss time, would step in and play a full workload. The main difference and reason he doesn't rank higher on this list is that Joe Mixon's injury is not noted to be as severe. It's even a possibility that he misses no time at all. So Samaje Perine, while it could be a good add for a temporary spot start, if Joe Mixon is healthy enough to play next week's contest, we probably can't recommend starting Samaje Perine. If you're in a deeper league, having him as a speculative add, a potential upside pick if anything were to happen more severe to Joe Mixon, in those cases, we can definitely recommend investing into him. But outside of that, in your standard 12-team league, you may want to look in adding other options this week off the waivers. Moving into the deepest position we have on the waivers this week, we have the wide receiver position, and leading this list, we have Jamison Crowder of the New York Jets. In his first game back returning from injury, week 4 against the Tennessee Titans, he received a whopping 9 targets, catching 7 of them for 61 yards, even scoring a receiving touchdown. This is very similar to the type of production he was posting prior to his injury last season, where he was a fantasy starter for the majority of his games. So even though the New York Jets did add weapons through the draft, bringing in top free agents like Corey Davis, it appears that Jamison Crowder, even returning to the lineup in his first week, is going to be one of the top options at the receiver position for this team. That is going to have a negative impact on players like Elijah McGuire and Corey Davis, but their loss is definitely the gain for anyone that can get Jamison Crowder off the waiver wire this week. Behind him, we have Darnell Mooney of the Chicago Bears. This is a player that a lot of people have given up on. A lot of people giving up on this offense as a whole, with Justin Fields starting. completing 6 passes in back-to-back matchups. So we can't be surprised that a lot of people gave up on not only Darnell Mooney, but Allen Robinson as well. But it appears that as soon as people did give up on him, Darnell Mooney posted the type of production we were expecting out of him originally. A 7-target performance, so not a whopping amount of volume, but his talent alone. He was able to turn those 7 targets into 5 receptions for 125 receiving yards, and even showing his versatility, another factor adding to his fantasy value, he had 1 carry out of the backfield that went for 10 yards. Ultimately, this was his best fantasy performance of the season. That does have to be taken with a grain of salt, though. This was against the Detroit Lions. With positive matchups even as early as next week against the Las Vegas Raiders, Darnell Mooney would likely have startability. This offense does finally appear to be trending in the right direction, so if anybody did end up dropping Darnell Mooney to the waiver wire, this would be the perfect time to add him. Behind him, the wide receiver 3 we have on the waivers this week, it's going to be Randall Cobb of the Green Bay Packers. He's coming off of a very vintage performance. While he did only receive 6 targets, they were all very valuable for him. He caught 5 of them for 69 yards, 2 of them even going for touchdowns. And with Marquez Valdes-Scantling being placed on the IR, the player in this offense from a receiver position who is looking to step up behind Davante Adams, the wide receiver 2 position in this offense is wide open, and Randall Cobb having the most chemistry with Aaron Rodgers and now proving to have a monster game in the process. I think Randall Cobb will continue to be used in this offense as the second leading receiver on this team. At least he is the favorite at this point. And with him being widely available in many leagues, adding him off the waiver wire could be a player that pays dividends for you for several weeks this season. The next wide receiver we have is Curtis Samuel of the Washington Football Team. This is a player that's owned in a lot of leagues. I understand that not everyone out there is able to get him off the waivers, but you can definitely trade for him. He is owned in only 59% of ESPN leagues out there, so 41% of you in ESPN are able to get him. But as mentioned, trading for him wouldn't be the worst idea either, because despite his heavy involvement, the fantasy output that he received wasn't all that high. He posted 5.9 PPR fantasy points, so anyone that did start him had a bust technically. But what was most promising to me was his involvement in his first game back, receiving 4 targets, catching all 4 of them for just 19 yards. And with him missing most of training camp, not being able to practice throughout the season, and not playing in any games up until this point, even receiving 4 targets and catching all 4 of them is pretty respectable. Yes, the output that he received, 19 yards, it wasn't the best, but again, that's only going to help anyone that doesn't own him potentially get him in a trade, because if he continues to be as involved in this offense as he was in this week, and potentially if his role's expanded, this could be an every week start for your wide receiver position. Fear not though, the final wide receiver that we do have is not owned in very many leagues. He's only owned in 27% of ESPN leagues. That's AJ Green of the Arizona Cardinals. And while it seems like every receiver on this Arizona Cardinals offense has produced from one time to another, the unfortunate reality is that if they're not producing top games, a la Christian Kirk in weeks 1 and week 3, or Rondale Moore in weeks 1 and week 2, the fantasy output and the level of targets and involvement we've seen from them in the offense has been very minimal. In fact, in many of the games where they're not competing to be one of the top receivers, those games they're posting virtual duds. Since Rondale Moore exploded in his first 2 weeks, posting over 35 fantasy points, he followed that up in weeks 3 and weeks 4 with a total of 5 receptions going for 29 total yards. Christian Kirk in weeks 2 and weeks 4, he had a total of 5 targets between the 2 games, catching 4 of them for a grand total of 70 yards split between the 2 contests. So while they may have helped you win a week in those games where they popped off, in the others they basically did the opposite. Could have hurt your team if you started them, and if leading to a loss, the win that they provided your team just a week before that, well, cancel that out because you're right back to square one. But if you're looking for a receiver outside DeAndre Hopkins that's been consistently involved in this offense in every week, in fact so consistently involved that he'd received the exact same amount of targets in each of the past 4 weeks, that's AJ Green, and as mentioned, he'd received 6 targets in week 1, 2, 3, and now 4. We've even seen his development and connection with quarterback Kyler Murray improve in each of the last 4 contests as well, reaching a pinnacle in these past 2 weeks where he's posted his best fantasy days, coming in with 16 fantasy points against Jacksonville in week 3, 5 receptions for 112 yards. Then in week 4 against the LA Rams, having his best fantasy performance with 5 receptions for 67 yards, but catching his 2nd touchdown of the season. This is now his 3rd straight game where he's had over 13 fantasy points, so definitely going to be in consideration to move up the rankings. Any injury sustained to either Christian Kirk or Rondale Moore will skyrocket his fantasy value, but if he were to continue to produce at the level that he has been over the past 4 weeks, then we wouldn't even be disappointed with the output. Right now, he is only owned in about 27% of ESPN leagues, so I'd definitely grab him now. I think a lot of people will be prioritizing getting him off the waivers, but with there being a lot of really solid options to get off the waiver wire this week, AJ Green may be flying under the radar. Moving over to the tight end position, we have 3 strong options, and this is going to be the part where I had mentioned in the intro. These are going to be common names that we've heard throughout the season, but didn't really buy into their production. But at this point, being now 5 weeks into the season, considering these players have produced now for several weeks, we do have to give them a bit of extra attention. And leading this list, we have Dawson Knox of the Buffalo Bills. Though he hasn't received an insane amount of targets, he's not one of the highest targeted tight ends in the league. He does have a consistent red zone role in this offense, and with the Josh Allen-led Buffalo Bills being one of the stronger offenses in the league, red zone opportunities are not going to be few and far between. He's going to have plenty, and if his role in the red zone is going to remain consistent and he's going to be one of the top targets in that area of the field, then him potentially being a tight end 1 for the remainder of the season is well within the card. The position itself is usually touchdown or bust, at least for the back-end TE1s, and while he is a top 5 tight end at this point, we're not taking him off the waiver wire with that expectation. No, I would expect him to be more of a matchup-based tight end 1, but if you're one of those teams that are needy at the tight end position, like many of us out there, then you could do a lot worse than getting Dawson Knox off the waiver wire this week. The next waiver wire option we have at the tight end position is going to be Tyler Conklin of the Minnesota Vikings. This is a player that I have ranked high, but many people won't consider him an add off the waivers this week because he didn't have a really strong performance in week 4. 6 targets, 4 receptions, only a mere 18 receiving yards. But what I thought was really promising was those 6 targets. When it comes to tight ends, we're not expecting them to have massive double-digit target performances each and every week, and with them coming off an 8 target performance, following that up with 6 targets is still pretty respectable. Yes, the output, just 18 total receiving yards, no touchdown, nothing to write home about, and that would technically be a bust performance from your tight end position, but with better matchups in the future and his upcoming matchup being against the Detroit Lions, there's a very strong chance that Tyler Conklin is going to have fantasy startability moving forward. The third and final tight end to get off the waiver wire this week is one that's produced very rapidly over the past 2 weeks. That's Dalton Schultz of the Dallas Cowboys. In week 3, playing on 69% of snaps, he saw 7 targets, catching 6 of them for 80 yards and 2 touchdowns. That was against the Philadelphia Eagles, ultimately putting up over 20 fantasy points, and with that being his best fantasy performance of the season, buying into him, being a player even splitting snaps with Blake Jarwin, it wasn't something I was interested in doing. Now seeing him post very similar production now in week 4, seeing 1 more target coming in with 8 compared to his 7 in week 3, and yet again he did catch 6 of them for 58 yards and even scored another receiving touchdown. At this point in the receiving game, Dalton Schultz is going to be by far and ahead the better option between him and Blake Jarwin, and in positive matchups where the Dallas Cowboys are projected to score many points, Dalton Schultz should be looked at as a potential start option at the tight end position. For that, we do believe you should be getting him off waivers. The Dallas Cowboys are one of the better offenses in the league, so if he continues to get looks in that area of the field, he should continue to produce, and with him now further separating himself from a production standpoint from the other tight end Blake Jarwin, Dalton Schultz certainly gives us a lot to look forward to. Ultimately, that is going to do it for the tight end position, but we'll move on to the final position, the quarterback position, where we do have 2 interesting options. Right off the bat, I'll tell you many, if not both of these players are going to be owned in most competitive leagues, especially everything over 12-team leagues. So if you're in a 14-team league, this player is probably owned, but it's Trey Lance of the San Francisco 49ers. Believe it or not, in ESPN leagues, he's only owned in about 19%, so widely available for many of you out there, but as mentioned, in deeper leagues, you'll unlikely be able to get him. But with Jimmy Garoppolo last week suffering a calf injury, Trey Lance is likely going to be the starter from this point on. What we should expect from him is a high floor quarterback, one that has plenty of upside in the passing game. While only starting for half the game, he put up a massive 20 fantasy points. So quarterback needy teams, you definitely need to target him. I would prioritize him as the top option off the waiver wire this week, even over Damien Williams. And when it comes to his weekly floor, that's just as safe as his ceiling. He saw 7 carries going for 41 yards. That was 4.1 fantasy points before even throwing a pass. And as mentioned, with Jimmy Garoppolo having 23 pass attempts before going down with his injury, imagine what type of upside and floor he could have in a full game starting. In the fantasy draft research process, Trey Lance was a top option for us at quarterback. We would have expected him to start at about the midpoint of the season, but with Jimmy G now having this injury, that's going to work out even better for anybody that drafted him. And as mentioned, he's currently available in over 80% of ESPN leagues. The final player we have is Sam Darnold of the Carolina Panthers. Believe it or not, even though he's produced in every week so far this season, he's still only owned in 18% of ESPN leagues, so even more widely available than that of Trey Lance. And believe it or not, on the season, he currently ranks as the quarterback 5, showing improvement in many key areas in each game so far this year, reaching a pinnacle this past week where he had his best fantasy performance, scoring over 30 fantasy points against the Dallas Cowboys, 39 pass attempts, 26 completions, his second game over 300 passing yards, his second multi-touchdown passing performance, and we already know he isn't afraid to rush in the ball. Through 5 games, he now has 5 rushing touchdowns, with 2 rushing touchdowns touchdowns now in back-to-back games, and with positive matchups in his future, now against the Philadelphia Eagles in Week 5, but in Week 6 seeing the Minnesota Vikings as a matchup, Week 7 against the New York Giants, and Week 8 against the Atlanta Falcons. These next 4 matchups all have upside within themselves, so Sam Darnold will likely remain a quarterback 1 option and one that comes with plenty of upside. But that's going to do it for the quarterback options. We'll have even more options at every position in our waiver wire section on our website, so if you haven't checked that out, definitely do so. But that's going to do it for today. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.